Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. Kentucky didn't secede from the Union during the Civil War. In fact, between 90 and 100,000 Kentuckians put on Yankee blue, and only 25 to 40,000 donned rebel gray. Yet today, across the state, Confederate monuments far outnumber Union monuments, and in the Capitol Rotunda in Frankfort is a statue of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who in 1861, like all Confederates, was officially declared a traitor by the Kentucky legislature. With me to discuss Confederate imagery many years after the Civil War are Dr. Duane Bolin, a professor of history at Murray State University, and Dr. Randy Patterson, who's retired from Belhaven College and Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. Welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
All of this Confederate imagery dates to the post-war period, when E. Merton Coulter famously said, "Kentucky waited until after the war to secede." Professor Bolin, what in the world did he mean by that?
Well, Barry, as you said, many more Kentucky soldiers fought for the Union than for the Confederacy, and so I think Kentucky turning toward the South really dates back to the Union occupation of Kentucky during the war. After the Confederacy, after the Confederates withdrew from Kentucky during the war, there were some notable atrocities committed by the Union occupation that turned many Kentuckians against the Union. There was for instance, the great hog swindle that, don't mess with Kentucky hogs. That will turn Kentuckians against the Union, where Kentucky hog farmers were forced to sell at lower prices to Union dealers. There was an order, I can't remember the order number, that for every Confederate death, for every Union death, 4 Confederate prisoners were executed, and I think the Union commander Stephen Burbridge was responsible for a lot of those atrocities before.
And it's also important to note that, of course, Lincoln was never popular in Kentucky. In 1860, he got 1,364 or 1,366 votes, depending on which total you look at. The Emancipation Proclamation was widely despised in Kentucky. Almost all white Kentuckians detested the enlistment of African American troops, and I think this is the period when this starts. And my students were often confused in my Kentucky history class, and I'll bet yours too, when I would tell them Kentucky Unionists were for the Union and for slavery. They were for a union with slavery, whereas the secessionists argued the only way to preserve slavery is to secede and join the Confederacy. Well, the Union forces argued back, no, the Confederates will lose the war, they'll lose their slaves. If we stay in the Union, we'll get to keep our slaves. And so you have this moving away from there. But again, the marvelous book, I'm going to plug this book if I may, Ann Marshall, Creating a Confederate Kentucky, The Lost Cause and Civil War Memory in a Border State. Ann Marshall is a Kentuckian. Duane, you know her, I know.
I knew her father. Bill Marshall, her father, was an archivist at University of Kentucky, and he helped me mightily when I was writing my dissertation at UK.
Indeed, and Bill Marshall also wrote a book called Baseball's Pivotal Era, and he interviewed my dad as a representative of the minor leagues. It's an excellent book. Here is what she wrote. I'll get you all to comment on this. And this comes from her book. The conservative racial, social, political, and gender values inherent in Confederate symbols and the lost cause greatly appealed to many white Kentuckians who, despite their devotion to the Union, had never entered the war in order to free slaves. In a post-war world where racial boundaries were in flux, the lost cause and the conservative politics that went with it seemed not only a comforting reminder of a past free of late 19th century insecurities, but also a way to reinforce contemporary efforts to maintain white supremacy. I thought that very well expressed it. Randy, talk about the lost cause in literature during this period. Lots and lots written about that.
Well, my dissertation studied the first efforts by Southern academicians to evaluate the literature of the South before and immediately after the war. And some of those first efforts were simply United Daughters of the Confederacy. And there was one man named James Wood Davidson, and he did the first book-length study. And of course, the attempt at that point by those quasi-evaluations was to say that the South was a civilization that, alas, had been defeated, that it had been a classical civilization built on the values of Greece and Rome, and alas, how awful it is now that that civilization is dead. And of course, they were drawing parallels between slavery in classical eras and slavery in the United States. Now, there were some early, to the credit of academia, there were some early evaluations that laid cold hands on the South. And there was one man at the University of the South, Sewanee, named William Peterfield Trent. And he was asked to do a biography in the American Men of Letters series of William Gilmore Simms, who had, according to Trent, compromised his considerable talent. Trent said that William Gilmore Simms was a talent of the magnitude of Hawthorne, Melville, and those writers from New England and the North. But he had gotten trapped defending the lost cause before it was lost. And Simms was from Charleston. He was not an aristocrat himself, but his second marriage was to a Charleston aristocrat. And he wrote novels and poetry, but he wrote a lot of polemical things defending the South. And so Trent was sympathetic to Simms and was making a case for his talent, but in the process, he laid cold hands on Southern civilization. Well, he was at the University of the South, and the Charleston elite from south of Broad, many of them were Episcopalians. Well, they got on the warpath, and they were going to get William Peterfield Trent fired. There was no place for him at the University of the South. Well, thanks be, I guess we Episcopalians would say, the trustees, many of whom were bishops in the Episcopal Church in the South, said no. They got some stiffness in their backs and said, no, we're going to stand for academic freedom. So while there was a lot of praising of the lost cause, defense of it, on the one hand, there were also some academicians who were looking more realistically. There was also another one at Vanderbilt, William Malone Baskerville, but he died early, which was sad because he did a series of essays on Southern writers, and George Cable in New Orleans, who was a friend of Mark Twain. And Cable actually got chased out of New Orleans, and William Malone Baskerville liked him very much.
Duane, describe Kentucky from the end of the Civil War through, say, the early 20th century. What was Kentucky like?
Well, one thing about this, about the lost cause, if you argue that that the idea of fighting the Civil War was for a Southern state, and if you argue that Kentucky was indeed a Southern state, that the idea was to maintain white superiority, then you could argue that the South did indeed win the Civil War, because after the Civil War in Kentucky and the rest of the South, for a brief period after the Civil War of Reconstruction, or in Kentucky, realignment, white superiority was maintained. And so those same ex-Confederates that were in control before the Civil War got back in control. And so you look at Kentucky, and whereas Kentucky was in the mainstream of national politics before the war with the Whig Party because of Henry Clay,
Right.
After the Civil War, there was a string of Democratic governors, and we were out of the mainstream politically. So all during the Gilded Age, the Republican Party reigned supreme nationally with only one Democratic governor, Grover Cleveland, throughout the Gilded Age. In Kentucky, though, one Democratic governor after the other. So we were in the mainstream politically with the nation before the war. We were out of the mainstream nationally after the Civil War. Kentucky, C. Van Woodward wrote a seminal work called The Strange Career of Jim Crow. And he argues in that book that Jim Crow segregation came later. And you could argue that was true. The separate coach law in Kentucky did not come until 1891. And so just a few years before the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. But you see the coming of segregation in Kentucky in the years after the war. Kentucky became a segregated state. Every aspect of Kentucky society. George Wright wrote a book called Behind the Veil about Louisville, and how there were two Louisvilles. He writes, there was white Louisville, and behind the veil there was African American Louisville, and he grew up, as he says, behind the veil in the black Louisville.
And interesting, Louisville was fascinating. It was a Union bastion during the Civil War, strongly Union, but yet big Confederate monuments come up after the war, and it always amuses me at Kentucky Derby time. Louisville puts on these Southern airs. Louisville's a Midwestern city. It's not a Southern city at all, and yet you see this. And again, another thing too, talking about these reenactors. These Civil War reenactors, the Confederates far outnumber the Yankees. If it had been that way during the war, they would have won. I mean, you think about it. The reason I said it, we went down several years ago to Shiloh on the weekend of the reenactment, and there were just swarms of Confederate troops and a handful of Yankees. And so this park ranger said, they would have won the battle if the odds had been like this. But you even find this in another thing too about some of these monuments. I was looking up. She talks about this preponderance of Confederate monuments. And there are Confederate monuments in some of the most pro-Union counties in Kentucky. Christian County, which is Hopkinsville, pro-Union. Lincoln County, extremely pro-Union. And if you go back and look at the troop numbers, which I have in the Adjutant General's returns, all these counties are rabidly Unionist, not Confederate at all. The only part of Kentucky that was Confederate was the Jackson Purchase. And someone whose name I can't recall wrote a book about that a few years ago.
Wonder who.
And I don't know, but I will tell you this.
It's a wonderful book.
That's what I hear. And Ann Marshall wrote a very nice review about it, which I'm sure that fellow appreciated. But it's fascinating. But if you drive Kentucky today, don't you think today most people think Kentucky is a southern state?
Yeah. Well, you have all in Kentucky, you know, around Derby time, we just witnessed that. You have all these symbols of the lost cause, like the mint julep. You know, nobody drank mint juleps in Kentucky. I love Henry Watterson's recipe of the perfect mint julep. You get all your ingredients, the crushed ice, the mint, the sugar, you know, and he said the perfect mint julep is throw all the ingredients away and drink the bourbon. That's the perfect mint julep.
Exactly.
You know.
Exactly. But it really fascinates me. And you know, you cross the river from Cincinnati to Florence, and it says Gateway to the South. It's something like Florence, you all. They don't talk that way up there. I've been to Florence. It's part of the North. But it fascinates me that you have this imagery of
in Florence and in northern Kentucky, you're closer to Canada than you are to the Jackson Purchase. In Ashland, you're closer to the Atlantic Ocean than you are to the Jackson Purchase.
Yes.
So there's many Kentuckys.
There is indeed. There is indeed.
Well, if I could just
please,
add
jump in.
sort of a dissenting note. I mean, we have to have dissenters and all that. But it may be sort of a matter of perspective and geographical perspective, because you said I professed in Mississippi, and indeed I did. I lived there for 45 years. And when I would say I was going to Kentucky, people would say, oh, I would say I'm going to Kentucky tomorrow. People would say, oh, well, you'll have a long drive, won't you? Will you have to stop and stay overnight before you get there? It's so far away. And I would say, no, if I did not drive the speed limit, I could be there in about 5.5 hours.
Yeah.
And while you're doing the comparisons to Canada and the Atlantic Ocean, there's an interesting comparison if you think of flagship universities like UT Knoxville, UK Lexington, University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, Oxford, University of Missouri, those states around us. By about 50 miles, the closest of those flagship universities to Murray, where we are, is, guess which one? Ole Miss.
Ole Miss, yeah.
Wow. Interesting.
Yep. Now that's as the crow flies. May not
Right.
be as you can drive.
Yeah.
But as the crow flies.
Well, because of the Mississippi River, you know, this area, the Jackson Purchase, as you know, always looked to the south. All the trade was down the river to the south. In northern Kentucky, though, it's all Cincinnati. It was all to the
Up
north.
that way toward Pittsburgh.
So,
yeah. Recently, the city of New Orleans has removed Confederate statuary, plus a monument to it was a white supremacist militia that fought a gun battle with the biracial New Orleans police. The monument went up and it says, to the preservation of white supremacy. Now, a few years ago, if you remember, Duane and Randy, there was a move to remove Jeff Davis from the rotunda in Frankfort. There was legislation proposed that had bipartisan support. The Democratic and Republican leadership of both the House and Senate approved it. I believe both candidates for governor at that time in 2015, Matt Bevin and Jack Conway, approved it. Governor Beshear said, well, let's let the Kentucky Heritage Commission or Kentucky Monuments Commission decide. And they kept it. Now, there is also a large statue of Abraham Lincoln there too, but it's still there. So why didn't Kentucky, a Union state, why is it still there, whereas New Orleans removed these other statues?
Yeah. I don't know why that was dropped. I don't know.
And it was. You remember the legislation?
Yes.
That was proposed, and it would look like a slam dunk. It would pass the House 100-0 and pass the Senate 37-0, but nothing came of it, and it's still there.
Yeah.
Well, New Orleans has leadership at this point that was very much behind it. I mean, Jackson slap in the middle of Mississippi. Well, there was a joke that wasn't too favorable to Jackson and Mississippi, but the two largest cities in Mississippi are Memphis and New Orleans. So we
Hadn't thought of that.
well, it's a commonplace saying if you want to look down on Mississippi.
Yeah.
And so we had close connections to New Orleans.
Oh, sure.
There were some people who would just drive down 3 hours for dinner, head down on a Saturday afternoon and go down and hopefully stay sober enough to get back in the
One
evening.
hopes.
Maybe not always.
Right.
But we kept up with what was going on, and public radio would tell us a lot about what was going on in New Orleans and Memphis. And Mitch Landrieu, the son of former mayor, and he was housing and urban development secretary under Jimmy Carter, the, I think, younger brother of Mary Landrieu, who was in the Senate for 2 or 3 terms. Mitch Landrieu, Caucasian, is the mayor of New Orleans and has had a number of successes. So I think an important part, sort of my take on that, is that the leadership has been very, very strong and influential in seeing that incredibly multiracial. I mean, you talk about layers of society.
Very cosmopolitan city.
It is, and the natives. There are the Cajuns and the Creoles and everybody
It's a fascinating city.
It's incredible, and the state as well. South Louisiana is just with the Cajuns.
Right.
It's an amazing.
Well, I think the
culture.
most powerful argument about removal of the Jefferson Davis statue from the rotunda is not the Confederacy angle. It's the fact that Jefferson Davis himself did not see himself as a Kentuckian. He always viewed himself as a Mississippian. And you have those the other 4 statues there were Kentuckians to the core. He was born in Kentucky, but then when he moved to Mississippi, he always saw himself and defined himself as a Mississippian.
Yes.
So,
Randy, you have some experience with the removal of the statue of one Senator Theodore Bilbo. And I have some quotes that I have mined from Senator Bilbo.
Oh dear.
And I just wanted to share those with our listeners and compare them, by the way, to an 1861 editorial in the Louisville Courier, Kentucky's pro-Confederate leader paper. Bilbo said, and I quote, "The South stands for blood, for the preservation of the blood of the white race. To preserve her blood, the white South must absolutely deny social equality to the Negro, regardless of what his individual accomplishments might be. If we sit with Negroes at our tables, if we attend social functions with them as our social equals, if we disregard the segregation on all other relations, is it then possible that we maintain it fixedly by the marriage of the South's Saxon sons and daughters?" His answer, of course, was no. Now compare this to an editorial in the Louisville Courier, which was Kentucky's leading secessionist paper, Walter N. Haldeman, editor. And he said this: "If the North defeats the South, it is absolutely certain that slavery will be exterminated." He goes on to say, "The result would be the equality of the races." And he asks a series of questions to non-slaveholders. "Do you wish to send your children to schools in which the Negro children of the vicinity are taught? Do you wish to give the Negro the right to appear in the witness box to testify against whites? Do you wish to see the Negro privileged to serve on juries sitting on their property, liberty, or life? Do you wish to be met at the polls and have your votes neutralized by the suffrage of free Negroes?" Just the same argument. Just the same argument. Now, on the other hand, the Louisville Journal was pro-union, as was the Louisville Democrat. But again, going back to this Kentucky change after the war, Haldeman leaves the state, comes back in 1865, restarts the Courier. Courier has a larger subscription, larger readership than the Democrat or the Journal. So what happens in 1868? He buys them out, and it becomes the Louisville Courier Journal. So you see who's on top there. And to me, that's a real metaphor for example of this in Kentucky. But again, this topic, it fascinates me. Now, Kentucky, of course, did have that bogus rump government organized at Russellville in 1861, represented minority opinion everywhere except the Jackson Purchase, totally extra legal, totally bogus, got a star on the Confederate flag, as did Missouri for a bogus government there. And I think maybe people see that and think this is, Kentucky was a southern state. But and Ann Marshall writes, this is the most revolutionary, it's just astonishing what happened in this state. And again, it's hard to figure. And I got, by the way, here are the list of some of these monuments where they are. Christian County, Hart County, Unionist, Jefferson County, Jessamine County, Unionist, Lincoln, Mason, Montgomery, Warren, all Unionist, Perryville Battlefield in Boyle County, Unionist. What's the big monument there? It's a Confederate monument. Who lost the battle? The Confederates did. So this is what you deal with within Kentucky. So you think Jeff will remain in the Capitol? Do we have the leadership to remove Jeff?
Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah. I don't know. How many Union monuments are there in Kentucky?
Duane, that's an excellent question. I can tell you, I'm going to say 2.5 that I know of. Now, what I mean by that, there's a Union monument in Lewis County in northeastern Kentucky, and that supposedly is the only monument built by public subscription in the state. It's a fascinating monument. At the base of the monument, it says something like secession was always wrong and the Union was always right. That was a very strong pro-Union county. There is a monument in Frankfort to African American Union troops, which you've probably seen that one. In Butler County, this is a fascinating, the monument is to both sides. Now, Butler County was very strongly Union, so it was put up as a Union monument, and then later they put Confederates on there. One of the best stories that Ann Marshall tells in her book is in Jessamine County, which again was Nicholasville, it's Union. They put up a Confederate monument, but they wanted to be cheap. So they found a Union soldier on top of him, but they modified him to make him into a Confederate, which is, I guess, the Kentucky way anyway. So
there were 23,000 African American
more
in
than
Kentucky.
any state except Louisiana.
Right.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. We are out of time.
Oh,
Always goes
Well.
by. And I need to excuse Duane. He's got papers to grade. And so Randy and I are retired. We can just kind of goof off anyway. My guests today were Duane Bolin and Randy Patterson. I'm Barry Craig. Thank you for joining us. We will see you next time.